The oratory ought to be what it is called, and nothing else is to be done there or stored there. After the Opus Dei, all should leave in complete silence and with reverence for God, so that anyone who may wish to pray alone will not be disturbed by the insensitivity of another. Moreover, if at other times some choose to pray privately, they may simply go in and pray, not in a loud voice, but with tears and heartfelt devotion. Accordingly, those who do not pray in this manner are not to remain in the oratory after the Opus Dei, as we have said. Then they will not interfere with anyone else. I have practiced traditional Taekwondo since I've been about the age of 10. And there is something very important to recognize when you are getting ready to step onto the mat, which is that the mat and the dojang, is to be used for its purpose, and that you have to have utter honor, sincerity, and respect, not only for the people who are using it, such as your instructors or your fellow classmates, but also for just the very space itself. When you walk onto the floor, you are walking into a space that is set apart for use in a specific fashion. And to put it another way, you are stepping into a particular space of reality that has its purpose. Its purpose is for the training in traditional Taekwondo, the training in martial arts. It's not meant for making meals for the kitchen. It's not meant for hosting parties. It's meant for the use of the school. And it is particularly meant for training someone in the art of Taekwondo. There is a very similar relationship to space that St. Benedict is trying to instill, which is that there are particular places in the monastery, most importantly, the oratory, the place where the prayers are said, in which that is what its purpose is. It is not for anything else but prayer. And it is to be used in a respectful way such that the other members may never be impeded from their prayers to God. There is no such thing as visiting after church, so to speak. Again, there's a significant difference between 21st century church and the 5th century monastery. But all to be said, when the prayers are done, the prayers are done. And anything else that needs to be taken care of can be done somewhere else. The space is really sanctified. It is a holy space. And in fact, the word holy, in a very kind of rudimentary sense, simply means a set apart thing. Something that is put aside for a specific and proper use. That is precisely what the oratory is. It is a place set aside for that purpose only. And recognizing that that space is a very particular holy space, the monastics are told to be very careful in when you enter or exit, when you use it, and when you're not using it, so that it can be used for its proper and holy purpose, and that there's nothing that gets in the way of its specific purpose, which is prayer. All guests who present themselves are to be welcomed as Christ, who said, "I was a stranger and you welcomed me." Proper honor must be shown to all, especially to those who share our faith and to pilgrims. Once guests have been announced, the prioress or abbot and the community are to meet them with all the courtesy of love. First of all, they are to pray together and thus be united in peace. But prayer must always precede the kiss of peace because of the delusions of the devil. All humility should be shown in addressing a guest on arrival or departure. By a bow of the head or by a complete prostration of the body, Christ is to be adored and welcomed in them. After the guests have been received, they should be invited to pray, when the abbot or prioress or an appointed member will sit with them. The divine law is read to all guests for their instruction, and after that every kindness is shown to them. The prioress or abbot may break their fast for the sake of a guest, unless it is a day of special fast which cannot be broken. The members, however, observe the usual fast. The abbot or prioress shall pour water on the hands of the guest, and the abbot or prioress with the entire community shall wash their feet. After washing, they will recite this verse: God, we have received your mercy in the midst of your temple. Great care and concern are to be shown in receiving poor people and pilgrims, because in them more particularly Christ is received. Our very awe of the rich guarantees them special respect. The book of Hebrews in the New Testament has a famous verse in it that perhaps you might recognize. It is the verse that goes such as this: Do not neglect your hospitality, for some have entertained angels unawares. Even though it's not necessarily quoted, especially in this section of St. Benedict, it is nonetheless the undergirding foundation of what exactly hospitality is for the Benedictine. In fact, one of the, as Sister Jones says, one of the things about Benedictines is that hospitality, in a very interesting sense, is to be prized above even those things that you can't gain an exception for otherwise. If you heard in the descriptions of when certain exceptions can be given, it should be readily apparent that in this section over hospitality, even the little bit that we've read so far, there have already been significant exceptions for the reception of guests as it comes to the normal everyday observance of the time. In fact, even meal times are adjusted such that the meals can be shared with the guest. There are exceptions to fasts even though the solemnities might be a little bit too far for the regular members, but still, there is some extreme leeway that is given in Benedict's rule specifically for receiving guests. And the undergirding spirituality, I think, should be fairly obvious, because in the same way that we are loving God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength in the ways in which we are disciplining ourselves under the rule, there is also that second part of that commandment, or the great commandment, or the way that Christ sums up the commandments, which is to love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments, love God and love your neighbor, hang all of the law and the prophets. And in that way, Benedict never wants the community to forget that care for the stranger, hospitality to the pilgrim, is in fact even more important than our personal asceticisms. Fasting is good. The reading of Scripture is good. The disciplining ourselves to be aware of God at all times is good, but it does not compare to the service of the other in our Christian life. We are servants of one another, and we are most especially servants of guests in St. Benedict's mind. And particular consideration is given to the poor and to pilgrims. And this particular focus on poor and pilgrims is that receiving the poor, those who might not have the protections or even the abilities to have food for the day, are particularly to be focused on. Because perhaps another scripture that is kind of undergirding this is that the gifts that the community gives, they know cannot be reciprocated. And yet this is also what Christ commands. When you give a banquet, don't invite those who can pay you back, but rather invite those who cannot, because your reward will be great in the kingdom of heaven. And so Benedict, in a practical way, is making the exceptions primarily, and I think ultimately, because that is what the aim of that other counterbalancing spirituality is. That we don't neglect the command of Christ for the stranger just because we personally are trying to attain some sort of spiritual height or circumstance. We are always reminded that we can never short shrift what Christ commanded in the summary of the law, that you love your neighbor, the pilgrim, the poor, the other, as yourself, because this is the content of all of the scriptural commands. And in the book of Hebrews, you might be entertaining angels unaware. The kitchen for the abbot and prioress and guests ought to be separate, so that guests, and monasteries are never without them, need not disturb the community when they present themselves at unpredictable hours. Each year, 2 monastics who can do the work competently are to be assigned to this kitchen. Additional help should be available when needed, so that they can perform this service without grumbling. On the other hand, when the work slackens, they are to go wherever other duties are assigned to them. This consideration is not for them alone, but applies to all duties in the monastery. Members are to be given help when it is needed, and whenever they are free, they are to work wherever they are assigned. The guest quarters are to be entrusted to a God-fearing member. Adequate bedding should be available there. The house of God should be in the care of members who will manage it wisely. No monasteries are to speak or associate with guests unless they are bidden. However, if the members meet or see guests, they are to greet them humbly, as we have said. They ask for a blessing and continue on their way, explaining that they are not allowed to speak. A historical note needs to be made about the guest kitchen. So, in the history of the Roman Empire, we are reading a rule that is written, codified, available within a particularly tenuous period of time. St. Benedict, in his monastic rule, is living in a time roughly during the dissolution of the Western Empire. We are beginning to be unable to speak of Rome as a power in the world any longer. And when it comes to that point, Benedict's monasteries and the monasteries of the Christian tradition become, in a very significant sense, the de facto hospice homes for an empire in which people and pilgrims and, to be quite honest, refugees are having to travel distances in order just to gain their safety. The monasteries and the walls of the monastery became a sign of hope and haven. And the reason why we have, in fact, a dedicated kitchen and a dedicated dwelling for guests of the monastery is not for any small reason, but rather that this was an immediate response of this Christian community to a particular thing that was happening at the time. And it should be said that the wanderings of the people groups that came by the monastery truly could have been anybody. Absolutely anyone could have been refugee or traveler or so on and so forth that are traveling on long journeys. And again, we have to kind of remember this was before the advent of cars, and this was largely done by either wandering caravans of peoples that may or may not have had livestock to assist them. And really, for the poor, it would have been largely on foot. So the monastery as a dwelling place that actually had some boundaries to it, that could in fact mark a safe place from the wandering vagabond, that is a significant source of hope and solace to anyone who might be a guest at the monastery. And in that very sense, Benedict makes some significant hospitable additions to what is supposed to be going on at the monasteries, both in their physical provisions, but also in their spiritual giving of themselves over to the guest. But it should be noted that it's not necessarily an accommodation of guests, as much as it is an extension of the hospitality of the true and sincere Benedictine community. Because again, it's not as if they are simply service providers in this sense. They are, of course, providing a service, but it should be noted, they still hold to the rule of which they are under, and they are indeed, in the same way, the regular monastics are still not permitted to speak to guests because that is part of their monastic practice unless they are bidden to do so by the abbot or prioress. There is an integrity both to the service of the guest, but also to still living the Benedictine style of life, style of spirituality that they have committed themselves to. Just because you work in the guest house does not give you permission to slack on your silence. Just because you work in the guest house does not mean that you give yourself over to idle talk. You still are Benedictines, but you are rather extending the particular Benedictine hospitality to anyone who comes to your door. And in that, I think that there's an important lesson to learn here, which is that there are aspects in which we as communities of faith, we as Christian communities, offer hospitality in a significant fashion of our own integrity that should never challenge or should never short shrift our integrity for the purposes of service provision. We're not simply accommodating people to whatever their wishes are. Rather, what we're doing is we are showing our sincere hospitality. But to quote a recent theologian, hospitality is also teaching someone how to be in your house. Hospitality is also to tell someone how to treat things. And so we are both extending ourselves, but we are also, in a very real way, asking our guests to both respect but also to understand what we are offering and what we are not offering. We are not offering to lay aside our identities whenever we serve someone, but rather it is through our identity that we give service unto God by the provision for those who might be guests. In no circumstance are monastics allowed, unless the prioress or abbot says they may, to exchange letters, blessed tokens, or small gifts of any kind with their parents or anyone else, or with another monastic. They must not presume to accept gifts sent them even by their parents without previously telling the prioress or abbot. If the prioress or abbot orders acceptance, they will have the power to give the gift to whomever, and the one for whom it was originally sent must not be distressed, lest occasion be given to the devil. Whoever presumes to act otherwise will be subjected to the discipline of the rule. It is quickly approaching the gift-giving season here, as we are in November now. We have just made it through All Hallowtide and All Saints' Day last week, and we, in our kind of secular culture, have already begun to be bombarded by the Christmas music of the time and the gift-giving season. It seems almost like a different world that Benedict describes. You can't even give gifts to each other or presume to give gifts without the permission of the abbot or prioress. It seems, perhaps maybe in some ways almost cruel. Well, this is a gift I'm giving. Why should it be that I can't bestow upon someone that which I have done? Or even, as it comes to Benedict's example, the parents of one who is a monastic want to give a gift. But again, that is to perhaps miss the point. The point of this is that the monastic is not to own anything outright privately. If they really are not owning anything privately, that means that they have to have a completely different relationship to not only their physical surroundings, but also to the very physicality of the universe itself. There is a significant shift when I have nothing of my own, and I am asked to rely on God fully and solely. I have a completely different sense of the provision of God when I have nothing myself. I think it's important to note this, especially as we approach the prospect of giving gifts to others this season. Are we simply giving gifts in a somewhat mindless fashion? Are we giving gifts to people that in any other shape or form would be seen as some sort of waste, even? Do things simply get given because it is the thing that you do, and our garbage piles continue to build up with those gifts that are simply discarded into the waste? I think that that's a fair thing to ask, especially given that our commercial empire, should I say, is built off of the proceeds and the revenue that is generated upon Black Friday, which is none other than the Friday after Thanksgiving. In fact, there is an incredible statistic that I read a few years ago that most companies, and I swear I'm not making this up, that most companies make 50% of their revenue or more in that one day because of the advent of online ordering or going to the store. I think that gives us incredible insight into how we have relationships with the physical universe, or perhaps a very toxic relationship with the physical world. There is perhaps something to be reflected upon whenever the Benedictine says, "I own nothing except what has been graciously granted, and I receive nothing as gift unless I receive it by permission." What would, maybe a challenge here, a Benedictine observance of gift-giving look like? One that is holistically about the community and not about private ownership. That is all about service to something bigger instead of to an individual. Maybe to put this in a little bit more kind of domestic sense, something that is good for someone's family, for someone's entire household, rather than simply a one-off gift to someone. Maybe it would cause us to think a little bit more communitively, that we think about things as large communities of people, families, and neighborhoods and things like that, rather than simply individual gifts. Maybe a Benedictine observance of gift-giving would actually provide us with a joyful way of understanding the particular giftings and offerings and what we give gifts for in the midst of the Christmas season. The clothing distributed to the members should vary according to local conditions and climate, because more is needed in cold regions and less in warmer. This is left to the discretion of the prioress or abbot. We believe that for each monastic, a cowl and tunic will suffice in temperate regions. In winter, a woolen cowl is necessary. In summer, a thinner or worn one. Also, a scapular for work and footwear, both sandals and shoes. Monastics must not complain about the color or coarseness of these articles, but use what is available in the vicinity at a reasonable cost. However, the prioress and abbot ought to be concerned about the measurements of these garments, that they not be too short but fitted to the wearers. Whenever new clothing is received, the old should be returned at once and stored in a wardrobe for the poor. To provide for laundering and nightwear, every member will need 2 cowls and 2 tunics, but anything more must be taken away as superfluous. When new articles are received, the worn ones, sandals or anything old, must be returned. Those going on a journey should get underclothing from the wardrobe. On their return, they are to wash it and give it back. Their cowls and tunics, too, ought to be somewhat better than those they ordinarily wear. Let them get these from the wardrobe before departing, and on returning, put them back. What one wears is not merely a sign of one's status, and should not, in Benedict's mind, demarcate themselves as anything other than simple, clean, ready, and functional. In the United States, the typical sort of functional clothing, very honestly, is often business casual in some cases, But it depends on what kind of work you're doing. Because if you're working in the fields, I'll tell you what, good pair of overalls, always nice whenever you're working out there. Wood shop as well. Whenever you are working as a mechanic, gotta have a good pair of coveralls to make sure that you're just not getting all kinds of junk and grease everywhere on your body. The type of work that one does and the type of work around the monastery, Benedict believes should be appropriate but not excessive. In other words, they are to be given what they need, not things in excess. And depending on how you want to interpret this, Sister Joan has a helpful note on this, says, there are some Benedictines who interpret this kind of more literal one-to-one ratio as like, you'll see Benedictines in modern day still wearing the cowl and the tunic and things like that. Other Benedictines have a little bit more dynamic interpretation of this in that Benedict was simply meaning, in the clothing of his time, you're supposed to wear something that is not ostentatious, that is simple but clean, things like that. They're not meant to be a demarker of, look at how spiritual I am in comparison to someone else. That is rather something that Benedict very obviously in his chapters on humility wants to completely squish. But it should be noted that all of these things are held in common. Again, no one owns their own clothes. They rather are given the clothes that they need and given the clothes that are appropriate to the task that they have to have, in the appropriate climates in which they serve, in the appropriate fashion in which they go about their everyday use. If you're going on a journey, gotta have some supplies for it. Gotta have clothes to be able to wear for going on a journey that are particular for taking journeys. And it should be, I think, really carefully noted that when there are new clothes received by the monastery, whether by gift or by fair purchase, the old clothes are not simply discarded. They instead are put into a closet to be given to the poor. And again, it's not that these old clothes are those that are completely tattered and useless. I think there is a very weird relationship in the United States between giving someone your old clothes and giving someone clothes that are perfectly reasonably functional. Having worked in a little bit of a nonprofit setting like this, it is really surprising how often people, whenever they're cleaning out their wardrobe or things like that, give to these nonprofits the just utter garbage that comes out of their wardrobe. Things that are ripped, are torn, are not fit to be worn, that just have all kinds of defects in them that are very obvious. It's not that they are good garments that can be used by the everyday person. It's that they're garments that actually are broken and need fixed. That's not charity for St. Benedict. Rather, the well-used clothes of the monastery, when you receive new ones, the older ones, not the trash, the older clothes are simply put in a place in storage for the poor. Now, of course, these clothes have been fixed, they've been mended, they've been taken care of, and a key note here, they've been taken care of. These are garments that are perfectly acceptable for anyone to be able to wear. And those are the ones that are donated to the poor. Not our leftovers, so to speak, but those things that have been cared for carefully. Such as when St. John the Baptist on the banks of the Jordan tells those, if you have 2 coats, give one to someone who doesn't have one. John is not saying, when you have 2 coats, give someone the one that is worn out and just needs to be gotten rid of. That's not what John is saying. And Benedict takes that very seriously. It's not that we're giving people the leftovers that are needing fixed. It's that we're giving people perfectly usable clothing, perfectly usable garments that have been taken care of, that have been perhaps mended over the years, and then they can use them. Because guess what? The poor still need functional clothing as well. How odd is it for us to have new clothes and simply give our ripped, torn, and unfunctional things to those who most need clothing? To be maybe a little bit pointed on this, perhaps sometimes it should be the other direction there. Perhaps instead, we need to be giving those who are underclothed those clothes that we have that are perfectly functional, rather than our leftovers. And perhaps, rather, our leftovers need to be more carefully attended to by us. That there's no such thing as throw-away garments, but rather there is what I need and what the other needs. For bedding, monastics will need a mat, a woolen blanket, and a light covering as well as a pillow. The beds are to be inspected frequently by the prioress or abbot, lest private possessions be found there. Anyone discovered with anything not given by the prioress or abbot must be subjected to very severe punishment. In order that this vice of private ownership may be completely uprooted, the prioress or abbot is to provide all things necessary. That is, cowl, tunic, sandals, shoes, belt, knife, stylus, needle, handkerchief, and writing tablets. In this way, every excuse of lacking some necessity will be taken away. The abbot and prioress, however, must always bear in mind what is said by the Acts of the Apostles. Distribution was made as each had need. In this way, the prioress and abbot will take into account the weakness of the needy, not the evil will of the envious. Yet in all their judgments, they must bear in mind God's retribution. What would it mean for you or for me to live simply with enough? What would it mean for me to live simply with enough in a world in which excesses are in fact a virtue? There is, I think, a good number of answers to that question, but for the Benedictine, even in the 5th century, one of the driving vices, those evil temptations that Benedict really is trying to highlight and eliminate, is this idea that I can have control over what I want, and therefore I can accumulate for myself all of these things that I want, that will make my life better, and that will make me, perhaps in some ways, socially, economically, or in other ways, superior or measured by the things that we have. What is that great American adage? The one who dies with the most toys wins. There's a tragic irony that is both where that quote originally comes from, but also in the ways in which our consumeristic culture constantly drives us to invention of new sorts of desires. There's a wonderful commentary on our kind of modern-day consumerism by a very world-renowned theologian, David Bentley Hart, who recently said, the interesting thing about Western economics, not just in the philosophical sense, but even in just kind of the materialistic sense, is that we are constantly asked to make up new desires. What he means by that is we are constantly manufacturing desires for ourselves. Think about just the rise of the video game system. There was no such thing as wanting a video game system until you have a commercially available product in the 80s and 90s. Now, you have huge, massive corporations, worldwide corporations that are selling these video game consoles worldwide in a way in which we desire those things. We desire those particular gaming consoles that have certain games on them, and we desire those games by their product releases and by their advertisements. And yet, in the 5th century, there's no such thing as that sort of desire. We have invented that sort of desire. Is that good? Honestly, I don't know. But Benedict wants to focus on Are we desiring that which is enough for us, that which is simple, joyful, and full, rather than vacuous and empty, even though we might have gained the world and yet forfeited our soul? Benedict never wants the monastic to be wanting for anything. And Benedict never wants the monastic to be desirous in a grasping sense for anything. There is utter balance in the way that we live like that, and there's no easy answer for how to live that way in a holistic sense in the ways in which we do right now. But perhaps a simple question to ask ourselves is, what does it mean for me to have enough? The table of the prioress or abbot must always be with guests and travelers. Whenever there are no guests, it is within their right to invite anyone of the community they wish. However, for the sake of maintaining discipline, 1 or 2 seniors must always be left with the others. While there are important allowances for food, for clothing, for provision, nothing is more important than the personal interaction of the table. In Benedictine spirituality and in Benedict's rule, the table of meal is the center of the life of the Benedictine that is that other side of the coin from the Holy Eucharist. The holy meal of the Holy Eucharist is also part and parcel of the way that the Benedictines recognize their own mealtimes. Nothing is haphazard at mealtime with Benedictines. I have dwelt at a couple of monasteries with Benedictines, and one thing I can tell you is that mealtime is taken very seriously. And I'm not meaning in sort of the performative sense. I'm meaning that meals at Benedictine monasteries have such a significantly different ethos than anywhere else that I've ever eaten. Because the time spent with each other around a shared meal under a common rule is something that is nigh non-existent in other areas of the world. And as a guest of those monasteries, what I can tell you is that the guests of the monastery are treated in particularly special, set-apart fashion by the abbots or the prioresses. Those who are guests of the monastery are primarily the care of those who are the lead of the headship. And the thing is that this is in fact a chief responsibility of the abbot or the prioress in seeing to the guests at mealtime, which is, to say it another way, the most important functional aspect of the kitchen is to be shared with the guests by the very person who is in charge of it all, by virtue of their shepherding capacity. That emphasis should not be overlooked as part of the hospitality and connection between the servant and those who are guests. In a wonderful way, this is in fact a participation in Christ's mystery of both the servant and also the guest. The pilgrim along the way, of whom we entertain angels unawares, and the one who stoops down to wash the feet of another. If there are artisans in the monastery, they are to practice their craft with all humility, but only with permission of the prioress or abbot. If one of them becomes puffed up by skillfulness in the craft and feels that they are conferring something on the monastery, they are to be removed from practicing the craft and not allowed to resume it unless, after manifesting humility, they are so ordered by the prioress or abbot. Whenever products of these artisans are sold, those responsible for the sale must not dare to practice any fraud. Let them always remember Ananias and Sapphira, who incurred bodily death, lest they and all who perpetuate fraud in monastery affairs suffer spiritual death. The evil of avarice must have no part in establishing prices, which should therefore always be a little lower than people outside the monastery are able to set, so that in all things God may be glorified. Sister Jones sums up this chapter, I think, in the best way that you can. There are three things in which artisans in the monastery are to be aware of. Number one, that there can be artisans in the monastery, those who make things, construct things, do things with the work of their hands. The second is that the skill of the artisan is not to be any source of pride and should not be something in which the artisan holds themselves in higher esteem than others. And the third is that those things that might be sold by the monastery, made by the artisan's hands, are not for the sake of money. On those three axes lies the Benedictine core of humility, practicing service, and also practical doing what the monastery needs. There is an intensely practical aspect to all of this. Those who can be artisans within the monastery and are able to provide funding for the monastery are not to be discouraged from their practice, but the counterbalance to that is that they are not primarily all about producing money. They are not, in this particular Western United States sense, they're not simply workers who are providing for the economic needs of an organization. In fact, it's made very clear that the monastery, when they sell the items, are meant to sell it at a lesser value than what the surrounding region may determine. And it's because they're not producing something to make an economic gain. They are producing something out of the giftedness of God in them for the service of those who are poor in the community. They have a primary audience for what they are giving, and what they are giving is a wonderful, beautiful gift to those who might not be able to afford the regular product itself. It relies on this balance between both the abilities of the person, in other words, they're not supposed to be discouraged from using their abilities, but also the point of why they're monastics in the first place. They're monastics because they're wanting to grow into the stature of Christ, not because they're wanting to be the best smith that anyone has ever seen at the monastery. That is, again, a root of pride. I want to be the best that everyone's ever seen. That's not what Benedict says is the point of it. We're not supposed to set out to try to be the best in spite of everyone else. Rather, we are meant to be the best that we can be in what we've been given, so that in all humility, we may offer our gifts for the purposes of our community and the surrounding community, but also may at the same time not be given over to something that would prevent us from our primary purpose, which is growth in Christ. We are meant to grow into Christ primarily, and the gifts that we bring along with us are those things that help us and others to be able to realize the beauty, the glory, and the purpose of a well-lived, balanced life.